All right, buckle up, folks, because this deep dive, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
We're dealing with a mid-air collision here, a commercial plane and a military helicopter, and it happened right here in the U.S. in one of the busiest airspaces we've got. 67 lives, just like that, gone.
Yeah.
And we're going deeper than the headlines. We're going to figure out the how, the why, and what it all means for all of us.
You hit the nail on the head. This isn't just another aviation incident. This is the kind of thing that makes you, well, it makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about air travel, and figuring this out, well, it's a puzzle. You've got physics, you've got human behavior, you've even got politics all mixed up in this thing.
It's a mess, for sure. Okay, so let's start putting these pieces together, right? It all went down Wednesday night, January 29th, 2025. So picture this. American Eagle Flight 5342. They're flying a Bombardier CRJ-700, coming in for a landing at Reagan National.
DCA.
Yeah, DCA. Anyone who's flown into DC knows that's a chaotic airspace. They'd taken off from Wichita, Kansas. Normal flight, pretty routine until, well,
At the same time, you have a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter, a Sikorsky H-60 out on a training mission. They're out of Fort Belvoir in Virginia. Now, DCA, notoriously tricky airspace. It's crowded, close to downtown, very specific flight paths.
Right,
And this all happens at night.
right.
Now throw a helicopter into that mix and your margin for error gets really, really thin.
And that's where it all went wrong. Tragically, those margins vanished. Somewhere during that plane's landing approach, these two aircraft, they collided. Both of them went down into the Potomac. No survivors.
64 passengers, crew on that plane, 3 soldiers on the helicopter,
God!
67 families, just shattered. That's the human cost here. We can't forget that even when we're getting deep into the technical stuff.
No, absolutely. It's easy to get lost in the how, but the who, that's what matters.
Yeah.
So how do you even begin to investigate something this complex?
Well, thankfully, the NTSB, they're basically the aviation detectives. They were right on top of it.
Yeah.
Brought in the FAA, the DOT, the DOD, even the U.S. Army. Everyone wants answers. And the first big breakthrough, they got the black boxes. Both of them. The planes and the helicopters.
So for someone who's not a pilot or an investigator or anything, what makes those black boxes so important? I mean, are they literally just boxes?
Well, that's a good question, actually. They're not boxes. They're bright orange cylinders, built tough, designed to survive a crash. And inside, you've got 2 recorders. One of them, it captures all the cockpit sounds, so pilot conversations, alarms, engine noises, that kind of thing. And the other one, it's recording all the flight data. Altitude, speed, direction, the whole thing. It's basically a timeline of what happened in those last moments.
So investigators are listening to those conversations, trying to hear any warning signs, any missed calls with air traffic control.
That's it. They're also looking at that radar data, weather reports, checking those flight paths, trying to figure out what that helicopter was doing during its training mission. But there's another thing we need to talk about. Situational awareness. Think of it like having eyes in the back of your head when you're driving.
Right, right.
In aviation, especially at night, busy airspace, even a tiny lapse in that awareness, a misjudged distance, it can be catastrophic.
It makes you think about every time you fly, just how many things have to go right, how many people depend on each other just to do their jobs perfectly.
Exactly. And that's why these incidents, rare as they are, they shake us to our core. Because it shows that system, that web of actions and technology, it's not foolproof.
It's a terrifying thought, and we can't forget, behind all those statistics, there are real stories here, real lives lost, like Azra Hussein Raza.
Oh, God.
26 years old, she was a consultant, just heading home from a work trip. Her whole life was ahead of her.
And Army Crew Chief Ryan O'Hara, 29 years old. He left behind a wife, a 1-year-old son.
It's heartbreaking.
The ripple effects of a tragedy like this, they go way beyond the immediate victims. It touches entire communities.
We also learned about the 6 members of the Boston figure skating community. They were on that flight. Coaches, young athletes, they were coming back from a training camp. What a devastating loss for the figure skating world.
Yeah. The Skating Club Boston, they lost some incredibly talented young athletes and 2 coaches, beloved coaches, Vadim Naumov and Evgenia Shishkova. They were married, former world champions. Their impact on the sport, it's immeasurable.
It really hits you, How many lives were connected on that flight? How many dreams were just cut short?
It's heartbreaking. And we can't bring those people back. But what we can do is learn from this, understand why it happened, and try to prevent something like this from happening again.
And that brings us to the next part of this whole thing, the political side of things. And I gotta say, President Trump's statements right after the crash, well, let's just say they didn't help.
To put it mildly, He was very quick to make claims, based on preliminary flight data, stuff that wasn't even verified by the NTSB at that point. He even went so far as blaming the previous administration's diversity and inclusion policies at the FAA, implying they contributed to the crash, all without any evidence.
It felt like he was more interested in scoring points than actually, letting the investigation run its course.
Exactly. And that's the danger of politicizing a tragedy like this. It can really hinder the investigation, distract from the real issues. The NTSB's job is to be objective, impartial, not to be swayed by political agendas.
And speaking of agendas, some of the details that came out about the air traffic control situation that night, it's pretty disturbing, especially knowing what we know now about those comments.
The concerning thing is that it seems only one air traffic controller was handling both helicopters and some of the planes at the time of the collision.
Wait, isn't that a job for two people?
Usually, yes. And we learned a supervisor had combined those roles earlier than usual that night. So you have to wonder why. Staffing issue, bad decision. These are questions the NTSB will be digging into.
Especially when you consider the data on staffing levels at U.S. airports. Over 90% of airport towers are understaffed, according to FAA standards. So you have to think, is this tragedy a symptom of a much bigger problem?
It's a huge red flag. Now, we can't say for sure if staffing levels directly caused this collision, but we know that tired, overworked controllers, they're more likely to make mistakes. And in a job where split-second decisions can be life or death, that's terrifying.
And then you add the fact that reports of near-mid-air collisions at U.S. airports have been rising for the past 20 years. We're talking an average of 385 a year in the last 5 years alone. That trend can't be ignored.
Absolutely not. It suggests there's a deeper problem within the system itself. Are we pushing it too hard? Are we putting efficiency over safety? These are things we have to face, and we have to do it now.
We've got this perfect storm, right? Understaffed air traffic control, more near collisions, and then this horrific crash. It's hard not to think like something was bound to happen, but we need to separate speculation from facts, right? That's what the NTSB investigation is for. What have they learned so far?
Well, they're keeping things pretty close to the vest, which is understandable. They want to be absolutely sure before they say anything publicly. But they've given us a few glimpses in their press briefings. First off, those black boxes. Remember we talked about those? They got the data from both.
Wow.
A huge win for the investigation.
So they're going through those recordings, the flight data. I imagine it's like trying to piece together a shattered vase, except every shard holds a clue to this whole tragedy.
Exactly. And from what they've said, it sounds like Flight 5342 was doing everything by the book. Standard procedure for landing on runway 33 at DCA. Now, the helicopter, we still don't know exactly what its mission was. That's classified. But we do know it was operating in a designated airspace corridor.
Along the Potomac.
Okay, so both aircraft were, in theory, where they were supposed to be, which makes this even more confusing. How do two aircraft operating in controlled airspace end up on a collision course? The million-dollar question, right? And that's where those black box recordings are so important. They might tell us if there was any miscommunication, any last-minute maneuvers, any signs of, confusion or panic from the pilots in those final seconds.
It's a grim thought, but if there's something to be learned from those last moments, maybe those recordings are the key. Something that could prevent this from happening again.
I think so. And that's why the NTSB, they're so meticulous. They're not just looking for what went wrong, but why it went wrong. Human error, equipment failure, a breakdown in communication. Those answers are crucial, not just for the investigation, but for the families. They deserve to know what happened to their loved ones.
Speaking of the families, I can't even imagine what they're going through. And on top of that, you've got the recovery effort. Recovering wreckage from a river, especially in winter.
It's an incredibly difficult task, incredibly dangerous. The crash site, it's in a fairly deep part of the Potomac, about 8 feet deep, and the water's murky, filled with debris, freezing temperatures, strong currents. It's a nightmare for those dive teams.
And to make things worse, the plane, it was badly damaged when it hit the water. It broke apart on impact. That must have made recovering the victims so much harder.
It did, from what we've heard. The DC Fire and EMS chief, John Donnelly, he described it as a touch-and-feel operation. Divers were basically feeling their way through the wreckage, almost zero visibility, trying to find the victims.
And every minute counts in a situation like that, right? The longer the bodies are in the water, the harder it is to identify them.
That's right, a race against time and the elements. A grim reality, but it's crucial for giving those families closure.
It's times like these that you really see how brave those first responders are. They're risking their lives to recover those victims, bring them back to their families. It's a reminder that behind the statistics, the headlines, there are real people who are hurting.
And those families, they're facing the unimaginable, grieving, rebuilding their lives. The impact of this crash, it's going to be felt for years to come. It's a tragedy that touches all of us.
And, it's in moments like this that you need leadership, unity. And instead, President Trump, well, he just adds fuel to the fire with his comments. To put it mildly, it was insensitive.
Yeah, his public pronouncements, especially those directed at the previous administration's policies, they were met with, well, a lot of criticism.
Right.
Rightfully so. This is not the time for finger-pointing or political grandstanding.
It felt to a lot of people like he was using this tragedy to attack his opponents, which frankly is pretty low.
You can see why people are upset. The NTSB's job is to be impartial, to conduct a thorough investigation without any political interference. President Trump's comments, they undermine that process, and they added a layer of controversy to an already horrific situation.
Even some of Trump's supporters, they had a hard time defending his comments.
Yeah, they argued that he was just raising legitimate concerns about systemic issues, things that might have played a role in the crash. But even if that was his intention, the timing, the way he went about it, it was a problem.
Especially when you consider what we've learned about air traffic control at DCA. The fact that there was only one controller managing both helicopter and plane traffic, that raises some serious questions about staffing levels and safety protocols.
It's a big red flag. And this goes beyond DCA. We know that over 90% of U.S. airport towers are understaffed, based on FAA standards. This is a systemic problem that needs to be addressed.
So even if pilot error was a factor in this crash, we can't just ignore the understaffing issue. It creates an environment where those controllers are overworked, stressed, and that makes mistakes more likely.
Exactly. It's not just about the number of controllers either. It's about their training, the technology they use, the overall culture of safety within the FAA.
And then you've got that incident back in 2018, that near collision near DCA. And guess what? Only one controller was managing both plane and helicopter traffic then too. It makes you wonder, did the FAA learn anything from that incident? Did they make any changes?
That's a question a lot of people are asking. And it points to a potential blind spot within the FAA. Maybe a failure to properly address these near misses, to implement changes that could prevent them from becoming major accidents. They might have gotten lucky in 2018, but it seems those same vulnerabilities were still there in 2025.
Like the system was sending warning signals, but no one was listening. Or if they were listening, they weren't doing enough about it.
It raises some tough questions about accountability, about whether the FAA is doing enough to keep our skies safe. And it brings us to a bigger issue. Is the aviation industry as a whole putting efficiency and profits ahead of safety? Are they cutting corners to save money? And are those corners costing lives?
It's a tough question, but it needs to be asked. Are we sacrificing safety for cheaper flights, for quicker turnaround times?
Yeah.
It feels like this crash, it blew the whole thing wide open, and now we have to figure out how to fix it.
It's a huge challenge, and there's no easy answer. It's going to take a lot of different things. Policy changes, technology, even our own expectations as passengers, we all need to adjust.
So let's talk solutions. What can we do right now to prevent another tragedy like this?
Well, the FAA took immediate action. They restricted helicopter traffic around Reagan National. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, he announced it as a way to increase safety and security in that airspace. Especially around DCA, it's so complex.
It's a start, but it feels kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a, much bigger problem. We need to address the root cause here, this chronic understaffing of air traffic control towers.
You're absolutely right. Over 90% of U.S. airport towers are understaffed. That's not something you can just ignore. The FAA needs to step up, seriously, recruit and train qualified controllers.
And it's not just about filling those empty seats, right? It's about creating a better work environment for controllers, reducing burnout, making them feel valued. Because if they're stressed and exhausted, that's when mistakes happen.
Exactly. Got to think long term here. Invest in the people who are literally holding lives in their hands every single day.
There's also been talk about new technology, more automation, and air traffic control. Would that help ease the burden on those controllers?
Well, yeah, technology can definitely play a part. Imagine systems that give controllers a clearer picture of the airspace, things that could predict potential conflicts, maybe even automate some of the more routine tasks they have. But We got to be careful not to rely on automation too much.
It can't become a crutch. We still need skilled human controllers, people making those critical decisions, using their judgment, their experience.
It's like technology is a powerful tool, but it's only as good as the people using it.
Right. So it comes back to training, making sure controllers have the skills, the mindset to handle these increasingly complex situations.
We need training that goes beyond just the technical stuff. We need to focus on situational awareness, communication, decision-making under pressure. And we need to build a culture of safety, where reporting near misses isn't seen as a weakness, but as a way to prevent accidents.
I think that's so important, creating a space where people feel comfortable speaking up when they see something that could be dangerous. Because right now, it feels like those warning signs, they're being ignored, or at least not acted upon quickly enough.
At the NTSB, they'll come up with a list of recommendations,
Mm-hmm.
changes to protocols, procedures, but it's up to the FAA, the airlines, the entire industry to make those changes, to create a system that puts safety first, above everything else.
And it's not just on them either. I mean, we have a responsibility too, right, as passengers.
Absolutely. We need to stay informed, ask questions, demand accountability.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to fight for safer skies.
I think we've all been lulled into this false sense of security when it comes to flying. We assume it's safe because it's become so routine. But this tragedy, it's a wake-up call.
And hopefully, it's a wake-up call that leads to real, lasting change.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want listeners to take away?
I want them to remember that safety, it's not just a word, it's a choice we make together every time we get on a plane. And it takes vigilance, communication, and a constant commitment to do better.
Maybe, just maybe, this tragedy can be the thing that finally changes things, the thing that sparks a movement to make air travel not just efficient and convenient, but as safe as it can possibly be.
That's what we're hoping for.
That's the hope. Well, folks, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's heavy stuff, but we believe in giving you, our listeners, the knowledge you need to make informed decisions and to demand a safer future for everyone.